There is a frequency that only opens after midnight. Most people spin right past it, a wall of static between the stations. But if you stop, if you hold there, sometimes a voice comes through. And some of those voices have been gone for a very long time. Welcome back to the midnight frequency. Turn the lights down. Put the world on hold. For the next few hours, it's just you, the dial, and the dark. What you're about to hear are the calls that came in on the nights nobody could explain, ordinary people, on empty highways and in quiet houses, all reaching for the same phone to say the same thing. I've never told anyone this before. Some of these stories are strange. Some are sad. And a few of them still don't have an ending. So settle in. Keep the lights where they are. The lines are open, and tonight, it seems, the dead still have something to say. Let's begin. In the dead of night, when most of America lay in silent slumber, something woke me. I remember the phone ringing at 3:27 a.m., just as I was settling into a restful doze beside the crackling radio in my old farmhouse. The dial was tuned to an eerie static that cut through the stillness like a knife. "Hello," my voice came out as more of a whisper, half asleep and uncertain. On the other end, there was silence for a moment, followed by the faint click of another phone being picked up. A man's voice finally broke the line, calm but urgent. "I've been trying to call all night," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "There's something strange about my house, and I think you need to hear it." As the host began retelling the story, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air grew colder in the room. Something was very wrong. "I live on Old Hollow Road," he started. "Just a few miles outside of Westview, Ohio. It's been like this for years now. Every night, the same thing happens." His voice held a tremor that betrayed his fear. "Tell us about what goes on there," I offered softly. He took a deep breath before speaking again. "It starts around 3 a.m., right when most people are finally drifting off. The phone rings, nobody knows how it's ringing, but somehow the call slips through even if no one is here to answer. And I prompted gently. "He always answers and then hangs up before speaking," he said in a hushed tone. "The line goes dead, except for that eerie static you can hear. It's like the receiver just disconnects on its own. And there's more than that." "What else do you experience?" "I've seen things, shapes in my window, barely visible in the dark. Voices whispering, distant but distinct. And it's not just me. My family has been here for generations, and they all know about this. Every night, it gets a little worse." The silence between us felt thick with dread. "Can you tell us what happened last night?" I asked. He hesitated before continuing. "Last night was the worst yet. The phone rang at 3:01 a.m., as usual. This time, I picked up the receiver, and nothing. No voice. Just that static. But then..." He cleared his throat. "Then the lights in my kitchen flickered twice before going out completely. It was dark enough to see my hand, but when I tried to turn on another light, it wouldn't work." "And what did you do next?" I urged. "I went outside to check if anyone had accidentally left a light on or knocked over something inside," he said shakily. "But as soon as I stepped onto the porch, I heard it, those whispers again, clearer than ever. It was like they were right behind me. And they followed me into the house when I tried to run back in. I bolted into my bedroom, and then," he paused, his voice hitching. "Yes," I prompted. "I woke up this morning, lying on the floor beside my bed," he finished in a whisper. "There was a note taped to the wall above me. 'You'll hear us tomorrow.' It's been like that every night." The static grew louder, as if the line itself was struggling with the story. I swallowed hard. So, you're telling us you've had this same experience every single night? Yes, he replied, his voice barely a whisper over the static. And it only gets worse. The last time, they followed me inside. This is so much more than just a ghost. It's something. Before he could finish, there was a brief crackle from the line that cut him off, leaving behind only an ominous silence. Do you have any plans to continue living in the house? I asked hesitantly. He didn't answer. The radio signal broke up more and more until all that remained was static, like the echo of something that had been said but couldn't be heard anymore. I sat there, staring at the screen where his image used to appear, feeling an icy chill run down my spine. That night, millions tuned in just as I did, waiting for that same sound, the phone ringing, throughout the rest of the night, hoping against hope it wouldn't come. The phone line crackled with static, and I squinted into the darkened kitchen. This ain't right, I muttered to myself as the dial tone held on, unwilling to break. My fingers trembled slightly around the receiver, my gaze fixed on the old map of West Virginia hanging above the fridge. Weston, with its sleepy charm and eerie history, hadn't they said that abandoned asylum on the hill was haunted? I'd always dismissed it, but tonight felt different. I dialed 914-725-3066, my heart pounding like a drumroll in my chest. The dial tone finally broke the silence, and I could almost taste the static as the host's voice coiled around me, his calm and unhurried tone a beacon of sanity in this waking nightmare. I'm your midnight host from the midnight frequency, he began, his deep voice steady yet somber. Tonight, we're opening up our lines for stories that chill to their cores. Let's hear about the ones where you can feel something creeping in the shadows, where you know it isn't supposed to be there. My throat tightened as I cleared my voice. Yes, I replied shakily. I have a story. The host paused, allowing me just enough time to gather myself before he continued. Okay, take your time. Tell us everything that happened, no matter how small it might seem at first. His words hung in the air like cold mist. I swallowed hard and started with my recollection of the old Weston County Asylum. It was like any other night shift for me, I said, trying to inject a sense of normalcy into my voice. I'd been working at St. Mary's Hospital in Weston for 5 years. They decided to close the asylum on the hill and convert it to storage space after all those patients left decades ago. There was a momentary pause as if he could hear the empty hallway stretching out before me, before he whispered back, and what happened one night changed everything. My voice hitched with emotion. I was working the graveyard shift, alone in that old building where no one went after dark. I could almost see him nodding in understanding. We had sealed up most of it, only a few rooms down on the ground floor were kept open for supplies. But around 2 o'clock, my phone rang. His voice grew even more somber. Your phone, he repeated softly. And you're sure this wasn't one of those old emergency lines that sometimes still get calls from the past? I shuddered involuntarily, rubbing my arms to ward off a chill that seemed to seep through me. No, it was my personal number, but I didn't recognize who might be calling. The line was clear, no static, just nothing. The host let out a long breath, his voice steady yet carrying a weight of the unknown. Go on. Well, I continued, I picked up and heard a whispering in the background, barely audible. Please, help us, it said, and then it was gone. My throat closed over as my mind raced through possibilities. The host's voice was quiet, almost hushed. Did you get any more details? Did anyone hear that with you? I shook my head, though he couldn't see me. No, no one else was around. I hung up and went back to my paperwork, but something something felt different when I looked out the window. He gave a soft, encouraging noise of understanding. What did you notice? I noticed that the old clock tower, which usually had its lights on, was pitch black, I said, my voice thick with unease. Everything else seemed normal, cold, quiet, but the clock wasn't ticking like it should. The host's words clung to me like the fog settling over the asylum grounds. That's strange, he commented thoughtfully. It really was, I agreed, trying to keep a hold on my composure. I went back to work and didn't hear anything else, until later that night. My voice broke as I tried to recall what happened next. After midnight, there was a knock at the door. The bell rang 3 times. There was silence for just a moment before he prompted gently, "What did you do?" I felt the tension tightening in my body. I walked down, cautiously. It was like the air got thicker and colder as I approached that locked door. My heart was pounding, I knew something wasn't right. "Then what happened?" he asked. I didn't let go of the handle, I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper now. I just stood there, not wanting to push it open, but then it opened by itself. The memory cut through me like ice water. And inside, nothing was there. But in that empty room, something had changed. The walls seemed to echo with an unspoken presence. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. The host's voice was barely more than a murmur now. Did anything else?" I shook my head again, the reality of what I saw making my skin crawl. "No, but when I walked out and checked the clock again, it had started ticking normally. Like nothing happened." There was a long pause, and then he spoke slowly, his words hanging in the air like a warning. "That's strange. Do you think?" I couldn't finish his question, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the void. "Do I think what?" "That something lingered in that old building?" My voice cracked. The host was silent for so long, it felt as though he might have hung up on me. Then, just when I thought I'd lost him, his voice returned with that quiet intensity. "We'll be here for your next call, if you decide to come back. Good night." As the line went dead, I stood there, listening to the silence of the asylum stretch out around me, empty rooms and a clock that ticked on without explanation. The phone rang again, but this time, I didn't answer. The midnight air was heavy with salt and the distant hush of waves crashing against the rocks. I had always been fascinated by the old lighthouse on Cape Elizabeth's northern tip, its beams slicing through the dark as if to guide lost souls away from these shores. Tonight, under the full moon, I felt compelled to make a call. The line went static before a familiar voice answered, slow and sleepy, but with an edge of concern. "Lighthouse Keeper's Radio. This is John speaking. What's on your mind?" I cleared my throat. "John, this is Ben from Cape Elizabeth. I have a story, something that happened to me, something that never made sense." A moment passed in silence, the only sound the hum of the radio, faint and distant. Then he said softly, "Ben, go ahead." The static crackled, as if the phone itself was whispering secrets. "It's about an old lighthouse on the north end of Cape Elizabeth," I began, my voice barely above a murmur. The room around me felt suddenly cold. "You see, it started late one night, late enough that even the moon had turned shy, hiding behind dark clouds. I was working the night shift at the local grocery store, a routine job with its own oddities. Sometimes, when the cash register rang through too much of my life, I would take a break and call into Lighthouse Keeper's Radio. That night, I dialed without hesitation, eager for any distraction. A few minutes later, the familiar static filtered in, along with John's mellow voice. "Ben," he greeted, as though knowing exactly who was on the line. The phone rang once, twice more, but no one answered at my end. By the time I returned to work, it was a cold hour outside. My fingers clutched the edge of the counter as if holding onto something. I wondered if this was too much for an ordinary night shift to bear, but curiosity won out. "Okay," John had said when I called back, his voice steady despite the strange circumstances. "Tell me about your lighthouse." The tower loomed over the town, a dark silhouette against the fading sky. It was built in 1853 and stood as a beacon for centuries. The lighthouse keeper's house had been part of it, a small stone building that housed one man at a time. That night, I decided to drive out to the lighthouse, even though my shift wouldn't end until morning. As I drove down the empty highway, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. The radio in my truck picked up a faint static, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. When I arrived at the lighthouse, the door creaked loudly in the wind. It was uncharacteristically quiet inside, almost too silent for comfort. A strong sense that something wasn't right tugged at me as I cautiously entered the keeper's house. In the kitchen, everything seemed normal, except for a single lamp left lit on the dining table. I flicked it off with a quick movement and peered around. That was when I heard the sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching from upstairs. Curiosity won out over caution as I ascended the creaking stairs. The door to the tower opened easily, revealing nothing but darkness. But then, I saw him, a tall figure in old-fashioned garb, his silhouette barely distinguishable by the flickering light. "Who's there?" my voice echoed back at me, hoarse and scared. The lighthouse keeper didn't respond. Instead, he began to climb the stairs with a hesitant step, as if uncertain of what awaited him. I followed, my steps echoing loudly in the empty space around us. Halfway up, something shifted. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it drowned out everything else. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt a chill seep into every part of me. The keeper didn't stop, he kept climbing, his form silhouetted against the sky. When we reached the top, the beam shone brightly for just a moment before flickering out. There was nothing, no one there. Just an empty room, cold and dim. The keeper hadn't stopped climbing, but now, I couldn't see him. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, trapping me in the dark tower. Desperate, I reached for my phone, only to find that it was dead, leaving me utterly alone in this eerie, empty place. And then, I heard his footsteps, a slow, deliberate ascent down the stairs, each step echoing like thunder. But when he reached the bottom, there was no one there. I sprinted towards the door, but it wouldn't budge. Stuck, locked shut with no key in sight. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door and yelled for help, only to realize that even my voice echoed back in a hollow, mocking manner. The only sound now was the static from the radio broadcasting faintly outside, mingling with the sound of a howling wind that seemed intent on driving me mad. As I stood there, trapped, I could see his silhouette again, a form moving slowly towards me, always just out of reach. He kept coming, as if he hadn't left at all. And then, it stopped. The door to the lighthouse was suddenly open, and the wind whipped inside, carrying with it a faint scent of salt water mixed with something far worse, something that made my stomach turn. I stumbled through the door and out into the night, running as fast as I could toward the safety of the town, but no matter how hard I ran, I heard his voice whispering behind me, "You should have stayed." The only sound now is the distant roar of the sea, a reminder that some things are meant to be left behind. The phone on the small nightstand beside my bed shouldn't have rung. It's not like anyone was calling me from Estes Park at 1 in the morning. But there it was, a soft, insistent beeping amidst the silence. I blinked awake, disoriented and cold, as I reached for it with numb fingers. "Midnight frequency," a calm, deep voice whispered into the receiver. Yes, I muttered sleepily, pressing a hand to my temples. The phone felt like an alien object in my hand, its warmth foreign against my chilled fingertips. I had this room once. The caller's voice was distant yet clear as if they were miles away, and I held their memories on this thread of airwaves. It was 1973, maybe 74. My dad's a real estate agent in Estes Park. Estes Park? I repeated blankly. The caller seemed to notice the hesitation. Oh yes, it's not too far from Rocky Mountain National Park. Small town with big mountains. Anyway, this place was called the Alpine Motel. It looked like something out of a ghost story. Windows covered in fog, lights flickering even when no one was home. A shiver ran down my spine despite the warmth of my sleeping bag. Anyway, the caller continued smoothly, I was working that night. I usually stayed up late anyway, long shift at the diner. I'm used to quiet hours. Anyway, it's not like there are a lot of things to do in Estes Park after dark. Silence hung between us before they spoke again. Then one day Dad needed me for something important. He said this room was always occupied, but he saw it as an opportunity, so he booked me into the Alpine Motel. Aren't you afraid? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long moment of silence on the other end before they sighed softly. Of course I was. But I needed that job. Dad was counting on me. So here I am, lugging my bags and suitcase through the snow toward this abandoned-looking building. And? I prompted gently. Then comes the strange part, their voice thickened slightly with recollection. Inside, everything is normal. Check-in desk, room keys, even the old coffee machine in the lobby. But as soon as you walk up to your room number, everything starts to feel a bit off. Another pause. The door seems cold somehow. Aren't doors always cold? I asked, trying for casual. No, they said, their tone firm and certain. It was like it had been locked from the outside by someone who knew exactly how to work that lock. Like someone took a lot of time preparing for me to show up just to close this door in my face. I swallowed hard, imagining the scenario played out in front of me. And then? I asked, needing them to continue. And then, it happened, their voice grew quieter, almost as if they were whispering into the wind. The key slipped from my fingers without warning. It clattered onto the floor like an old leaf. But when I turned around, the door was locked. There wasn't even a way to unlatch it from inside. A knot formed in my stomach. Did you get in? A whole hour passed, waiting for someone to open that door, they whispered. But nothing ever happened. The room stayed empty and unoccupied until the end of that night shift, and I never worked at the Alpine Motel again after that. There's always some part of me wondering what would have happened if I had tried harder. Silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Thanks for sharing, my voice broke on the last word. Yeah, they said softly before hanging up. The phone slipped from my grip, and I lay there staring at it as static crackled in my ears. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in just like that locked door. And then came the chill, a cold draft that made me shiver even though every window was closed tight. A whisper of a sound echoed through the empty space, metal shifting softly against metal. And I knew it wasn't the wind. Don't touch that dial. Stay with me. The next one is worse. In the quiet of a winter night, when the streets of historic Charleston barely hummed with life, Sarah stood alone outside St. Michael's Episcopal Church. She had always been drawn to the old building, its Gothic spire reaching toward the moon like an ancient finger. The cold, crisp air clung to her breath as she pulled on her scarf and straightened the collar of her coat. She knew about the church's reputation for being haunted, but it was only this night that she realized a single pew held more than just stories from the past. As she stepped inside, the door creaked softly behind her, echoing through the nave like an old song. The air was thick with musty wood and the faint scent of incense. Sarah scanned the pews lining both sides of the aisles, each one looking unremarkable except for one. It stood out from the others, situated near the altar on the right-hand side. The light from the chandelier played over its back, casting a cold shadow that made her shiver. "Is this really going to work?" she whispered aloud, half hoping someone would answer. She approached the pew and sat down carefully, her fingers brushing against worn velvet. Immediately, an icy chill seeped through the fabric, as if the wood itself was breathing in a mournful sigh. Sarah pulled up her coat and scooted forward, but the cold seemed to follow her, like a ghost whispering in her ear. "Should I?" she murmured, glancing over her shoulder. The church was silent, save for the distant creak of floorboards. She let out a breath, trying to steady herself. It was just one night, and she could leave any time. But something inside her pushed forward, and she began reading the Bible aloud, her voice reverberating off the stone walls. As Sarah continued, she noticed that not only was the pew still cold, but the temperature in the entire church seemed to drop. Her breath formed visible clouds around her lips, and the hair on the back of her neck prickled. She glanced around, but there was no one else here, it was just her and the church. Midway through a psalm, Sarah felt an eerie silence settle over her. The cold had spread like frost, seeping into every corner until the room was almost oppressive with it. Her skin crawled as she finished her prayer and sat back, only to realize that not once had anyone else entered the sanctuary since she arrived. In the darkness, a faint scratching sound pierced the air, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the wooden floor. Sarah froze, listening intently. The noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to emanate from right above her. She could almost imagine small hands drumming against the pews, barely perceptible but unmistakably there. "Who's up here?" she called, not caring if anyone heard. The scratching ceased abruptly, leaving a heavy silence. Sarah looked around again, this time focusing on the pew in front of her. To her horror, it was exactly as cold as the one behind her, the air humming with an unexplainable chill. She stood up, intending to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside, sealing them both inside the church. Panic began to rise in her throat as she turned to face the altar where the icy pew sat untouched by any but herself and perhaps a cold presence no one else could see. "Why are you doing this?" she asked aloud, despair gnawing at her resolve. The church remained silent save for the distant ticking of a clock. It seemed to mock her, marking time in a place where it shouldn't matter. Sarah's breath came out in quick gasps as she pressed both hands against the cold pew, feeling something hard pressing back through the fabric. "What do you want?" she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. A faint creak sounded behind her, and Sarah whirled around to see the door finally opening a crack. She rushed for it, but when she pulled, it slammed shut with a violent jolt. Inside the darkened church, the temperature dropped even further, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the world. "Stay away from me," Sarah screamed, her voice echoing in the empty space. The scratching started again, louder and more insistent this time. It was as if something knew exactly what it wanted, something that wouldn't stop until it got it. Sarah stood there, alone with the church and its silent, frigid pews, feeling a cold dread wash over her. She realized too late that she might have just opened a door to something far beyond her understanding, or perhaps something that had been waiting for just such an invitation all along. The scratchings grew more frantic, as if trying to break through the silence. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. As she turned to run, she saw a flicker of light at the end of one aisle, just enough to make out the shape of the icy pew standing solitary and untouched among its warmer counterparts. The church was still, except for the rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. Sarah stumbled backward until she hit something hard and turned around just as a cold hand gripped her shoulder. She screamed once, long and loud, but no sound escaped beyond the walls of St. Michael's Episcopal Church, where the cold pews remained untouched and unheated in the dead of night. The tapping continued, echoing through the empty church as Sarah was left alone with the icy pew. The night was thick with static, like the air itself hummed with electrical whispers. The midnight host's voice cut through it, calm and steady as he introduced himself. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's 3 in the morning on the midnight frequency. I'm your host, Michael, and tonight we have a story that will surely stick with us." The caller, whose name was Tom, spoke hesitantly into the microphone. His voice trembled slightly as he began his tale. "It started just after I got home from my night shift at the Butte smelter plant. The streets were empty, except for the occasional distant car horn. I thought about how weird it is that the bell in the old mine still rings. It's been closed down for years." Michael paused briefly to let Tom's words sink in before continuing. "And what exactly makes you say that, Tom?" Tom's voice grew even more strained. "That's just it," he said. "It never used to do this. But now, every night around 2 a.m., I hear the bell ring from the old mine shaft, uphill from where I live." Michael responded thoughtfully. "Can you be certain of the timing? You mentioned that you hear this precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning." Tom adjusted his position on the couch, hugging his knees to his chest as if bracing for something. "Yeah, every single time. It's like a ritual or something." Michael took a moment before asking his next question. "And have there been any other peculiarities since you noticed this happening?" Tom's voice faltered. "There are things I can't explain. Like how the phone rings in the middle of night, even though it's dead. And once, when I went out to investigate the bell." Michael's curiosity was piqued now, his tone growing more intense. "Go on, Tom. What happened?" Tom hesitated again, then whispered, "I got back home, and my front door wasn't closed like I remembered it being. The lock seemed different." The host's voice held a mix of disbelief and concern. "Did you check the windows or other doors? Were they all locked as usual?" Tom shuddered slightly, his breath visible in the cold air. "I checked everything, nothing was touched except for that door. It was as if someone had been there but no one should have been." Michael leaned into the microphone, lowering his voice to add weight to his next words. "And when you tried to open that door?" Tom's voice broke slightly. "It opened like it always does, but, after a moment, it started to creak and groan as if something was inside trying to shut it again." Silence hung in the air for a few moments as Michael considered how best to phrase his next question. "Have you noticed any changes around your home or nearby recently?" Tom seemed hesitant before answering. "Just this odd bell, Michael. And that's about all I can say right now." Michael's voice became softer but no less urgent. "Can you try not to move anything in the house for a while? Keep an eye out and see if any other strange things happen." Tom nodded mutely. "Good," said Michael. "I will do my best to check on this myself when I can. For now, stay safe, Tom." The call ended with the soft hiss of static. Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "Well, that's our story for tonight, another mystery wrapped up in the echoes of an abandoned mine shaft and the cold shadows of night." A pause lingered between host and listener, heavy with unspoken fears. Michael lowered his voice to its lowest whisper as he closed out the segment. "And so, dear listeners, keep your lights on a little longer this evening, because you never know what might be waiting in the dark. Good night. The first time I saw him, he was standing in the shadows of that balcony. It was just after 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. The rest of the theater was quiet. I alone was here to run through lines and fight my own nerves. There should have been no one up there, but there was. He stood still as a statue, his back against the railing, eyes fixed unflinchingly ahead into the empty seats. I didn't immediately notice him. The lights were dimmed, just enough for me to see the stage and its props, a wooden desk with a single lamp on it. I stepped over a folding chair, my feet heavy from my day's shift at the diner down the street. My fingers traced the keys of the keyboard as I waited for the opening bars of the piano accompaniment to start playing automatically. Then he turned his head toward me, and I gasped. His eyes, so deep and hollow, seemed to see right through the curtain and into my soul. They were the color of coal, cold and unyielding. He wore a dark coat that had seen better days, and an old, crumpled theater program held loosely in one hand. I didn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as he watched me back. The sound effects began to play automatically, whispers, creaks of the floor, the distant ticking of a clock. Each little noise made his gaze flicker just a fraction more toward me. By the time the first rehearsal notes started to spill out of my mouth, he had moved slightly into the light. I caught brief glimpses of his face as he watched me intently, his expression never changing. His lips were a thin line, and despite not moving much, there was something almost feral about him, like a cat waiting for its prey. The air around us felt thick, heavy with something unnameable. The stage lights flickered briefly, casting odd shadows that danced on the walls. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it clung to me, growing more oppressive by the second. Then, just as abruptly, he turned away from me and back toward the empty seats. He slowly ascended the steps leading down into the auditorium, his movements so smooth that they seemed almost mechanical. The lights went out as soon as he vanished, leaving only the pale glow of the stage spotlight. I rushed to my desk, trying to find some answers or at least a way to record this bizarre encounter. As I sat down to write, I noticed the old program in his hand was now lying on top of an unimportant sheet on my keyboard. Its pages were blank, yet strangely, they seemed to hold something sinister. I stared at them for a long while, running my fingers over the words that never were. The silence that followed felt heavy and full of meaning, like a weight pressing down on me from all sides. I couldn't focus, my hands trembled slightly as if I'd just escaped something real and dangerous. When the phone on my desk rang, I jumped. It was still too early for anyone to be calling, and it seemed to echo around the empty theater with an unnerving clarity. The number was one I didn't recognize, just a series of random digits and letters. My heart raced as I hesitated, then finally answered. "Hello. Are you alone?" came the voice on the other end, soft but insistent. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good." The line went dead before I could ask anything further. The theater was still, save for the sound of my own breathing and the distant ticking of clocks hidden in the shadows. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady myself. When I opened them again, he was back where I had first seen him, back on that balcony, watching, waiting. But this time, I couldn't move, or scream, or do anything but stare back at him. It was just another quiet shift in the diner. Dawn wasn't going to come anytime soon in the early morning hours of February 14th. The static on my radio drowned out any chance of news. I was alone, listening to my own breathing and chewing gum, with nothing but a flickering light from the overhead bulb. I remember turning up the music just enough, soft jazz to keep me awake. It wasn't until the diner's door creaked open that I noticed it, a car parked by the door that hadn't been there before. The diner was empty except for me, and as I reached into the cash register, I saw the headlights of another vehicle turning down the road. A familiar white truck pulled up in front, its engine idling. "Hey there," said Jack from behind the counter, his face already red from working the midnight shift. "Thought you might be lonely." I smiled but didn't return to my desk. Instead, I walked out of the diner and down the empty street. The chill of February had a way of making the quiet seem even more profound. My steps echoed, and when I got back to the bridge, there she was. Samantha, a local, known for her kind smile but now lost since an accident that had turned her into something we just couldn't explain. She always appeared at dusk, standing in the bend of the old iron bridge over the Allegheny River. Her figure stayed unchanged, always wearing the same red coat, her long dark hair blowing slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I hesitated at first, but eventually, I stepped out to join her. "Hey there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" She looked up and smiled softly, that ghostly smile that sent shivers down my spine. She didn't respond verbally. Instead, she pointed to the opposite bank. There, in the cold and dark water, her reflection flickered like an old television set. And then she was gone. That was our first night. But every single night after that, as if drawn by a gravitational pull, I found myself back there at the bridge just before dusk. The bend of the river, the same spot where her figure appeared and disappeared again. Tonight, though, things felt different. As the last ray of sun faded into the horizon, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was the diner's pay phone outside, and that in itself sent a chill down my spine. Nobody used it anymore. I answered cautiously. "Hello." My voice sounded thin over the line. A quiet, almost hesitant whisper seemed to drift across the bridge. "It's me." My heart skipped a beat. It was her. "Samantha. Are you there?" But before she could answer, the connection cut out. The phone went dead, just like that. And I found myself back at the bend of the bridge again, the cold night air biting against my skin, as if trying to pull me into the river. And then, without warning, a sharp noise echoed from somewhere downriver. It sounded almost like a splash. Or maybe it was just the wind whispering through the trees. But she was there. I could feel her presence in the bend of the bridge. And that's when I noticed the reflection again, faint but unmistakable. She wasn't alone anymore. You're listening to the Midnight Frequency. Keep the lights where they are. In the stillness of an abandoned plantation house near Baton Rouge, the kitchen seemed to breathe. It was late, past midnight, when the call came from someone named Marley, a single woman who worked the graveyard shift at the local diner. Marley's voice was quiet, hesitant as she recounted her story. Marley had grown up in the small town of Vidalia, where everyone knew the old mallet plantation, with its sprawling grounds and decaying grandeur. She visited occasionally, just to remind herself that not everything from her childhood remained unchanged. But when she answered the call asking about paranormal experiences, Marley was skeptical. "I remember those years," she began, "when Mama would let me come up here on Sunday afternoons." Marley paused, a soft sigh escaping as if she were trying to hold back tears. The radio hissed softly behind her voice, adding to the eerie atmosphere. She had moved out of town for college but still visited occasionally when she needed to feel close to home. One summer evening, she returned from a long night shift, feeling drained and alone. She knew the old house was off limits, haunted by stories of its last mistress's tragic death. But curiosity got the better of her. Marley found herself creeping into the main house, drawn by the oppressive silence. She crept through the darkened rooms until she reached the kitchen, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Here, light from an old chandelier threw long shadows on peeling wallpaper. The walls had a damp, musty smell, thickening the air like a cloud. Marley stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her. The room was quiet, too quiet. Marley took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she walked across the linoleum floor, which seemed unusually cold underfoot. She turned on an ancient, flickering light bulb that hummed loudly and cast harsh shadows. The kitchen looked exactly as she remembered, the same worn wooden tables, the same mismatched chairs, and those pots hanging over a gas stove, unused for years. But something was amiss. A pot hung slightly askew, its handle barely touching the edge of the hook. Marley's eyes widened. It had never been like that before. She tried to ignore the feeling in her gut as she pushed aside thoughts of ghosts and settled into an old chair at the table. Just then, a cold breeze seemed to sweep through the kitchen, leaving Marley shivering. She glanced around but saw no one or nothing out of place. The radio crackled softly. "Hello, Marley. Are you there?" Marley frowned, looking back at the stove where she had last noticed the misaligned pot. It was now perfectly balanced again. Her phone rang, a muffled sound from the distance. The kitchen felt wrong, too real somehow. A low hum in the air made her skin prickle. Marley's heart raced as she tried to focus on breathing steadily. Then came the first stirrings of the pots and pans. Each one seemed to move on its own, swaying slightly back and forth, almost imperceptibly. "What is this?" Marley whispered, her voice barely audible over the radio static. The pots didn't stop moving, they started clinking softly against each other, creating a rhythmic tapping that filled the kitchen. She tried to calm herself, but as she listened, the sounds grew louder and more urgent. A low rumbling echoed through the room, making her chest tighten with fear. Marley jumped when she heard a faint, whispering voice, so quiet she almost missed it. "Come back," said the voice, barely audible, lingering between air and darkness. "You belong here." Marley's breath caught in her throat as the pots began to whirl, dancing together in an eerie waltz. She stared at them, trapped in a nightmare that felt more alive than any dream. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as the kitchen transformed under a sudden light that flickered violently. In that instant, Marley's phone rang again, startling her so much she nearly dropped it. Her hands trembled as she answered, but before she could speak, the line cut out with a sharp static. The pots and pans stopped moving, their clinking slowly dying away into silence. The whispering voice was gone. Marley stood up abruptly, leaving the kitchen in haste, her feet echoing through the empty house. Outside, the night air felt colder than ever. She drove home, her mind reeling with what she had seen, unsure if it was real or just a vivid nightmare born of late-night musings and too much time alone. And as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, Marley whispered into the darkness, "What did you mean, you belong here?" The phone rang again. I let out a deep breath as if the line had just released its tension into my room, empty but for the scratch of pages I held in my hands. It was a night shift at the hospital, and I needed every ounce of willpower not to succumb to sleep. The dial tone was just a static whisper, almost too faint to hear over the hum of fluorescent lights. That's when it started. A schoolhouse, Dodge City, Kansas. A place that should have been long forgotten, yet its doors were open to me in this dark and lonely hour. I picked up my pen and wrote. The phone number belonged to a schoolhouse that had been closed for decades. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knew each other's names and secrets were hard to keep. But even here, no one seemed to know about the old schoolhouse on the hill by the river. I wondered if the land itself remembered better. The phone rang again, and this time, I hesitated longer before answering. "Hello?" My voice crackled into the air, almost as if afraid of what it might hear back. The static was louder now, a buzzing in my ear like little bees swarming around an open hive. "You've reached the Dodge City schoolhouse after hours," a robotic female voice read out, dry and empty like a forgotten tape. It lasted only 3 seconds before disconnecting. I stared at the phone, feeling as if it were watching me with its eyes closed tight against the world. I called again, dialing the number into my memory in case this time would be different. The phone rang once, twice, then, like an old clock striking midnight, it began to ring back. My hand shook as I pressed my ear closer to the receiver. On the third ring, a voice picked up, almost too soft and scratchy for me to make out clearly. "Hello." It was a child's voice, small and timid. The static on the line distorted every word, making it sound like they were speaking from miles away. "What's this about, after hours? Why are you calling me at night?" The line went dead again, but not before I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing through an empty hallway. They grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right outside my own front door. A chill ran down my spine. The cold seeped into my bones as if it were a tangible force. And then came that voice again, so close now I could almost feel its breath on the receiver. "Did you come here to play?" The phone slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud, but before it even landed, the line went dead once more. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might have moved or any shadow that hadn't been there a moment ago. But all was still. The night air in Dodge City hung heavy and thick, like it had forgotten its purpose long ago. And I remained standing alone, haunted by those small voices and the empty threat of the schoolhouse after dark. The phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning, cutting through the silence of Oldham County like a sudden whisper. Marissa was jolted awake from her restless slumber, her heart pounding as she reached for the receiver. "Hello." Her voice cracked, echoing off the walls of her sparsely furnished apartment. "Marissa?" The voice on the other end crackled with static, but it was unmistakably her ex-boyfriend, Jack. "Did you catch that radio show I host?" "Yeah," Marissa said, her fingers tightening around the receiver. "What time is this supposed to be airing?" Jack laughed softly into the microphone. "It's one of those late-night shows, you know, like midnight or so." His words were muffled by static, and a distant noise that sounded eerily like footsteps. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice higher with anxiety. "I can barely make out what you're saying." "Just give it a moment," he replied, the static clearing slightly. "Listen to this part." His voice grew quiet, as if trying to catch an elusive echo. The air in Marissa's apartment seemed to grow colder. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The static hissed and popped, then fell silent for just a moment before cutting back in, sending a chill down her spine. Then, faintly, she could hear the distant sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking down an old hallway. Marissa's heart raced as she listened to the rhythmic thud against the floorboards. "Jack," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady, "what is that noise?" "Nothing," he said quickly, his tone changing from casual to urgent. "Just static. It happens sometimes." But Marissa knew better than to trust a simple explanation. She looked around her bare room, then at the phone in her hand. The noise had faded back into the background, but she could still hear a low hum, an almost imperceptible buzzing that made her skin crawl. "Tell me you heard that," she said to Jack, her voice more desperate than before. "I did," he confirmed quietly. "It sounded like a gurney rolling down the hallway." "That's strange, right?" "Where was I?" "You were telling a story about a sanatorium," Marissa replied, her mind racing. "About the one in Louisville." There was a moment of silence on Jack's end, and then he said, "Right, that one." You know how old buildings can sometimes feel wrong. His voice trailed off, leaving an unsettling pause. What did you say about the sanatorium? Marissa pressed, feeling her throat tighten. Jack hesitated, as if remembering something important. There's this hallway at the end of the sanatorium, he said slowly. They used to wheel patients down it, carts with gurneys and all that. They called it the Ghost Walk. Marissa felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The hallway. Why are you telling me about this now? I didn't mean to, Jack began, but his voice trailed off again. What did the hallway look like? Marissa demanded, her grip tightening on the receiver. There was another pause before he whispered back, it's always dark and empty. The lights never seem to work right. And they say it's haunted. The static grew louder, almost drowning out Jack's voice. I should probably go now, he said shakily. Wait. Marissa shouted into the phone. Why are you talking about this? Why is there a gurney rolling down an empty hallway? But before Jack could answer, the line went dead, leaving her in darkness and cold silence. The phone rang once, twice. I grabbed it reluctantly at 3 a.m., staring out into the empty night that seemed to watch me from miles of pitch-black highway. I was a janitor at Moundsville Penitentiary, working the night shift in Block B, 5 years now. I could count the times on one hand when it happened. The cell on row 5, column C, the one I'd seen filled by an inmate only once, seemed to be doing something different. The block was locked and secure. I heard the distant click of keys jangling together as I secured the door for the night. Then silence, no sound of breathing, no movement, just the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It felt like a trap had been sprung, something not meant to be witnessed by human eyes. But my job was to make sure everything was properly locked up and secure. The row of cells on row 5 looked calm. I paused at C, as always. Okay, I whispered into the cold night air. You must stay. I could feel the chill as if it were a physical presence, pressing against my spine. I stepped away. Locking the door behind me, I turned to walk down the hall. The block was now dark, save for the faint green of the exit sign blinking on and off at the end. Back in the main office, I filled out the final log entry, Block B, locked as scheduled. But something tugged at my mind, a whisper so quiet, it might have been nothing. The next night, after securing the cell block once more, I stood outside that door for a long moment. A chill swept over me, and I rubbed my arms to chase away the feeling. Then I stepped inside. Row 5, column C was not empty. Inside, a man sat slouched against the wall, his expression blank as if not really there at all. He wore a thin jail uniform, eyes flickering in their sockets like coals barely kept alight. A ragged beard and tangled hair framed his face. He seemed to exist solely as a reminder of the cell's purpose. I froze, heart pounding. The man didn't react. I could see the cold seeping into the walls now, an icy fog that left trails of frost on the floor as my shoes moved. I stammered, you must stay. The words felt like lead in my throat. He didn't move or acknowledge me. Just sat there, watching with a hollow, unblinking gaze. I grabbed the radio attached to my belt and called for backup. But nothing came through on the static-laden line. The block was isolated here, miles from any other cell block. It was just me in this empty prison, with one man who refused to be there by his own choice. The cold spread until I could barely breathe. The man's eyes shifted, locking onto mine. I turned and raced down the hall, back to my post at the main office. Later that night, as I lay on a cot in the small dormitory, I couldn't shake the feeling of that cell, that man, staring back. A phone call, a whisper, a shadow. What if it wasn't just a story? The phone rang again, echoing in the silent room. This next call came in just after 3, the hour they say the veil is thinnest. The midnight air was crisp as I stepped out of my car and locked the door behind me. The cold cut through my jacket like a knife, sending shivers down my spine. Tonight was one of those nights, the ones that feel particularly heavy with an invisible weight pressing down on everything around you. I worked alone at the old Johnson cabin, situated by the frozen lake on the outskirts of Whitefish, Montana. This place was meant to be a sanctuary for the occasional hunting party or outdoor enthusiasts, but as the years passed and snow sealed its windows, it had become nothing more than an eerie reminder of what once was. As I made my way toward the cabin door, I noticed something unusual. The porch light flickered as if caught between two currents of electricity. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if perhaps someone else had arrived before me or if this was just one of those nights when reality bent slightly out of place. I shook off the feeling and entered the dim interior. The inside of the cabin held memories of simpler times, now long forgotten under layers of dust and abandonment. The walls were adorned with hunting trophies and family photographs that seemed to watch over me, but tonight, something felt different. An odd sense of unease settled in my chest as I moved through the rooms, checking on my supplies for the night. It was always a silent affair, no creaks or groans from the old wood here. Tonight, however, it was as if everything waited. That's when I heard it, a distant sobbing sound that seemed to come from somewhere below ground level. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, the kindling of an old wood stove settling into place. But then came another cry, louder and more desperate than before. It tugged at a part of me I didn't know existed, a part that wished for nothing but to investigate. Descending the staircase that led from the main floor to the cellar was no small feat. The steps creaked under my weight, each one an echo of something long buried. As I approached the bottom, a single stream of light leaked through a gap in the door, casting long shadows across the floor. Peering inside, I found it empty, no cellar, no signs of life or death. Just emptiness that swallowed any sound and any light. But then, there they were, two small pairs of feet in snowshoes, standing motionless on the floor. Two tiny hands clutched at a piece of driftwood, their little faces framed by the flickering of an old oil lamp. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I approached, and for a moment, it was as if they were speaking directly into my soul. A sob caught in my throat, followed by another, more desperate cry. I couldn't tear myself away, it was like being drawn in by an invisible thread. "Please," I whispered, "what do you want?" The little hands clenched tighter around the wooden piece as if holding on for dear life. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished. I stood there, my heart pounding against my chest, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Outside, the cold air shifted as though it too was aware of something gone wrong. It was as if a veil pulled back from reality, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed the truth behind this place. But when I stepped outside again, there was nothing but the quiet of the night broken by the distant howl of an unseen animal. The call line was about to close for tonight. There's more that can't be said, more that haunts in the silence between these walls and under the frozen lake. In the quiet of an October night in Newport, Rhode Island, Jack Marlowe hung up his coat and slung his keys onto the sideboard by the door. He flicked on the old rheostat lamp, its dim light casting shadows across the musty parlor where a faint echo of classical music drifted from the locked wing down the hallway. Ever since his great-grandfather's will specified that the western wing remain untouched and sealed, Jack had only peered in through the small window, never venturing inside. But tonight, with the autumn chill seeping through the narrow streets, he felt an inexplicable urge to explore. The house was so much more than a home, it was a museum to history. Jack crept up the creaking staircase, trying not to think about the stories his grandmother used to whisper at night, tales of ghosts and forbidden rooms. He stopped at the door leading to the wing, its latch clattering softly in the silence. The music had grown louder, more insistent. He turned the handle hesitantly. The door yielded with a groan, creaking loudly enough that Jack flinched. Inside, the room was unchanged since his great-grandfather's time. Dust motes drifted through the beam of light he cast into the dark corners. A grand piano rested in the center, its top dusted clean. And from somewhere beyond it, a melody played with an otherworldly clarity. Jack approached the instrument and noticed a small, dusty recorder perched on the stool beside him. It was a model he had seen in old photographs, his great-grandfather's personal device, kept hidden away until today. He picked up the recorder, feeling its smooth surface with trembling fingers, and turned it on. The music suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. Jack took a step back but then caught sight of something peculiar, a faint shadow moving behind one of the large windows. He squinted, trying to make out what it could be. Was he seeing things? A flicker of light played across the wall just as quickly disappeared. His heart raced. He stepped closer to the window, his breath misting in the cool air. Through the dusty panes, Jack saw a figure standing on the lawn outside, staring up at him with an unsettling intensity. The figure was clothed in old-fashioned garb, its face obscured by shadow but unmistakably human. Or so he thought. A sharp crack echoed through the room, and the recorder's screen flashed to life briefly before going dark again. The figure in his vision vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. Jack spun around just in time to see the door slam shut behind him with a resounding thud that seemed more like an echo of his own fear. He faced the piano once more, but there was no music and no sign of movement inside. The only thing left was the recorder, its screen now still and silent. Jack picked it up again, almost hoping to find evidence of what he had seen, but the device remained unresponsive as though it knew nothing of his encounter. He turned to leave, every step feeling louder than usual. As he reached for the doorknob, a cold breeze whispered through the doorway, making him shiver despite the warmth of the house. The door was already locked from the outside, and he found himself face to face with the window once more. Through it, he could see nothing but the shadowy outline of his own lawn, empty and silent. Jack took a deep breath and stepped back into the hallway, closing the door behind him with a final click that seemed to resonate through the house. He hurried down the stairs, each step echoing ominously in the now empty wing. The music had stopped again, and he was left alone in the stillness of the old manor, wondering what had just transpired. As he slipped out into the night air, a cold laugh seemed to echo from within, but when Jack turned back towards the locked wing, it was as silent as ever. And so, Jack Marlowe walked away from the house that night, his curiosity satisfied, or at least, unsettled, leaving behind the manor's locked wing and the haunting music that still played just beyond the reach of his sight. The phone line cut through the silence like a razor. I had been calling in late shifts to the midnight frequency, always on edge as it played old records and scratchy tales of the unexplained. Tonight, my name was spoken by the announcer. "Hello, Galesburg. Are you there?" A shiver crept up my spine at the familiar voice, low and steady as if he were sitting right beside me in that grimy diner booth. I cleared my throat and took a deep breath. "Hi," I said finally. "Yes. I'm Jim. Tonight, we've got a true story for you." A caller shares an eerie experience about the old train depot out of town. Stay tuned. The static crackled loudly, almost as if protesting, before fading to reveal the sound of an empty room, maybe someone turning pages. The number is 906-287-3145, Jim's voice continued. This is the number you need to call if there's something you want to share. There were times I debated whether these stories were just tricks for late-nighters, like those eerie 4 a.m. phone calls in the movies. But as he mentioned the old train depot, something stirred inside me, an insistent tingle of dread that rooted itself deep in my stomach. My hometown, Galesburg, wasn't much. A few factories, a small main street with a few diners and shops, nothing too exciting. The depot, on the other hand, was history. It had been decommissioned years ago, but it still stood, its grand facade now overgrown with ivy, peeling paint, and a sense of abandonment that almost made it feel haunted. I heard more pages turning. Just about a mile outside Galesburg, there's an old train depot, Jim said. It's where the last train for the night used to stop before turning back. But now no one ever stops anymore. His voice was still calm, but I sensed something darker creeping in. So why did you call this number tonight? He pressed. I hesitated. It wasn't a story that easily came to mind, not something people usually shared. The lines blurred between the real and the supernatural here. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of my phone ringing again. This time, it sounded like someone had picked up. Hello. Hello. It was a scratchy voice that seemed to come from outside the room. You there? It asked again, more insistently this time. I swallowed hard. Yes, I replied, almost whispering. Why are you calling me? The voice lingered for a moment, then hung up abruptly, leaving only static in its wake. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had just happened. Maybe it was nothing. But the sound of that scratchy voice echoing through my phone didn't sit well with me. Suddenly, Jim's voice was back, steady and unbothered. We're going to tell our story now, he said. Stay with us. I nodded absent-mindedly into the darkness as Jim began his retelling. A few weeks ago, there was a man who worked night shifts at a factory not too far from here. His job involved loading boxes onto trains that would take them down to Chicago and beyond. It wasn't exactly glamorous work, but he kept it for the sake of his family. The man's name was Will. He lived alone in an old house on the edge of town, which made for quiet nights and plenty of time to listen to the midnight frequency. One night, Jim continued, after his shift, Will decided to stop by the depot one last time. It had been years since it had seen a train, but he was nostalgic. He figured he'd see if anyone was around, check on some old friends. Will walked through the empty tracks and onto the platform. The air was cold, and the silence was thick with history. Suddenly, there was a pause in Jim's voice. Then, he said softly, the train stopped. The phone line was dead silent until suddenly, a trembling voice cut through the night. Hello. Hello, is anyone there? I need to tell someone my story. I cleared my throat. Good evening. This is Midnight Frequency. Your call has been received. Please take your time. If you're alone, find a warm place and settle in. The caller's breaths came in ragged gasps. It was just, late at night, I was working the graveyard shift at the old orphanage on the edge of town. A distant car engine sputtered by, breaking the eerie calm. I'm listening. Please continue, I urged. I shouldn't have stayed so long, the voice sounded weak and worn. It's just a few miles out, past the old cemetery. But that's where my sister got us into trouble once, remembering stories from our childhood about the orphanage being haunted. I never believed her, but one night, it all came crashing down. A pause, followed by an audible shiver. After closing up, I was alone in the kitchen. The place is old and cold. You can feel the history there. It's almost like the walls are trying to tell you something, whispering tales you're not supposed to hear. I remember walking through those hallways, dusting pictures on the walls that had been untouched for years. Static crackled over the line. I heard a noise, like someone taking shallow breaths, right there in the hallway where children used to run and play. But it was so quiet, nothing echoed back. I ignored it at first, thinking maybe I imagined it or a mouse had gotten into the place again. More static. Then, a small click as if something was moving. The phone started ringing, but that shouldn't have been possible. It's an old rotary phone with no service out there. No one was supposed to be calling in at all. The lines should have been dead. And yet, I picked up and heard someone whispering, "Please come back," over and over. A long, uncomfortable silence. The voice sounded small and frightened, almost like a child. But that's impossible, right? I put the receiver down, thinking maybe it was just static playing tricks on me. I couldn't shake off the feeling of eyes watching me from the shadows, but when I checked, everything was normal. Another pause, deeper than before. I went to make coffee and thought maybe the noise had scared me or that my sister's childhood stories were starting to get to me. But in the kitchen, there were children's shapes pressed against the windows. They looked at me with empty eyes, like they knew I was the one who didn't belong. And then, there it was, a small window on the second floor creaked open just enough for light to spill into the hallway. The voice grew almost inaudible. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen to the spot. I could feel something crawling up my arm, a cold, wet sensation like ice water. And then, static filled the air, swallowing what should have come next. The line went dead. I waited for another few moments before speaking into the void. Thank you for sharing that story with us tonight. Are you okay? If there's anything else you'd like to say or add. If you're still with us, good. A lot of people stopped listening alone after this one. It was one of those nights when nothing should have been happening. I lay on my old, threadbare couch in the cramped apartment above Johnny's Diner, sipping lukewarm tea and staring at the flickering TV. Savannah, as always, wore its moonlit silence like a shroud. The city was asleep, but for me, the night had only just begun. The phone rang suddenly, startling me from my reverie. My heart raced. I was usually alone in this place by midnight. As I reached for the receiver, a static crackle filled the air, a whisper of wind, maybe, or something else entirely. My hands shook as I answered. "Midnight Frequency," the calm voice said softly into my ear. I just wanted to share something. Something that's been bothering me. My voice caught in my throat. The host paused, his deep breaths almost audible through the static. "Of course, caller. We're here for your stories." I took a sip of tea and tried to steady myself. "My name is Emily. I work graveyard shift at the city cemetery. Last year, our caretaker, Mr. Thomas, passed away. He left behind this little cottage right by the gatehouse." A low rumble from the radio cut off my words, as if the night itself had paused to listen. The caretaker's house is a small place. Wooden porch, old white siding chipping away at its edges. But there was one thing about it that I noticed. Every night, just after sunset, a light would turn on inside. A single lamp in the living room. Mr. Thomas would always keep the main lights off to save power, but this small light never failed. Static interrupted me again, sending tiny shivers down my spine. It was a strange habit, but I never gave it much thought until after he died. Then people started asking about it. Was he watching over the graveyard? Keeping an eye on things? The host's voice held no judgment, just his ever-present calm. I took another sip of tea, feeling more alone than before. Then one night, it happened. I was coming home from work, and as usual, I needed to stop by the gatehouse. Mr. Thomas's cottage was dark, the light that usually burned in the living room was off. Curious, I walked past and saw a note tacked onto his front door. The static faded momentarily, allowing me to hear my own breath, shaky and fast. The note said simply, "It will be on every night now." My hands shook as I turned the page over, another line in neat handwriting, small and precise. "Until everyone is safe." A pause, long enough for a whisper of wind outside. And then it started happening. The light began to go off at sunset, but it would flicker back on before midnight. And not just once a week or twice, the light came on every single night, without fail. The phone crackled again, as if the radio itself was uneasy with what I had shared. I tried to figure out its timing. Was there some pattern? A full moon that made it come on stronger? But no matter how many nights I observed, the light stayed on at sunset and off before midnight, always. Another shiver ran through me. Then last week. Last night, something changed. The note was gone from his door, but instead of staying off before midnight, the light came back on just after. And it didn't go out again that night. The host's voice was steady and reassuring, cutting into my dread. "Well, Emily, I hope you're all right now. Do you have any idea why this is happening?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Not really. It just feels like something isn't quite right. And that little light keeps burning, waiting for someone who's not there anymore." The radio hissed and died, leaving me with the sound of my own breathing in the small apartment. "Until next time," the host said softly. Midnight frequency signing off. In the small Louisiana town of St. Anne, where the Mississippi River hummed under the stars and old oaks watched over sleepy streets, lay the once grand ballroom du Lac. Tonight, it was silent again, its wooden floors untouched by any footstep except the steady drip-drip of time itself. The phone rang in Mrs. Evelyn Dupre's living room. She picked it up with tired fingers, her eyes flickering to a small photo on her nightstand, a family portrait from happier times. The line crackled static as if the radio had fallen into an old riverbank and stirred with silt and whispers. "Evelyn Dupre," she said, trying not to shiver in the chill of the room. "Mrs. Dupre. This is Thomas LeBlanc from the New Orleans Times-Picayune," a voice rasped over the airwaves. "I spoke to your cousin earlier, heard about your grandmother's ballroom. I'm reaching out to see if you have any more details." Thomas's tone was no less eerie for its calm. Evelyn felt a knot form in her stomach, wondering what it would be like to walk alone through the abandoned ballroom du Lac after dark. "Of course," she replied, forcing herself to speak clearly. "I can tell you everything. And might I ask why you called us? Did something strange happen last night?" Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. Last night. The ballroom had been empty as always, but something felt off. "No," she said tightly. "Nothing, really." "Really?" Thomas pressed. "Well, I can offer our listeners another chance to call in if anything unusual happens between now and midnight. It's an open line for tonight only." The phone began to ring again, jolting Evelyn from her thoughts. She stared at the receiver as if it might vanish. "Just one question," Thomas said, his voice growing more insistent. "Did you happen to hear any music?" Evelyn froze. There was no radio in this house. No music played except on rare visits when her husband would hum along with old records. But last night, she could have sworn she'd heard it. A slow, lilting tune that seemed to float out of the ballroom's empty hall. "Did you hear anything?" Thomas repeated. She shook her head, still holding back a shiver. "No. It sounded like someone was dancing." Thomas let out a low whistle. Dancing? Alone? Evelyn hung up the phone and leaned against the wall, trying to steady herself as she thought about last night's oddities. The old ballroom hadn't creaked or groaned, its silence had been oppressive. But then, the music. She looked at her watch and saw that it was only 9:30 p.m. The night wasn't even halfway over yet, and already something seemed amiss. Evelyn glanced toward the window. The moon cast a pale glow over her yard, and beyond it, the ballroom dulac loomed, a silent sentinel in the shadows. She shivered but reached for the phone again, deciding to jot down notes as she called back. "Hello." Thomas's voice was calm but urgent. I need to go," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I think I'm going to check on it." The line went dead as quickly as it had come alive earlier. Evelyn looked at the receiver for a moment before grabbing a coat and heading out into the night air, feeling the cold seep through her bones. As she approached the ballroom, the moonlight reflected off broken panes in its windows, casting eerie shadows that danced across the empty space inside. With every step, the crunch of gravel underfoot grew louder, a stark contrast to the silence within the building's walls. Evelyn paused at the entrance, her breath visible in the cool night air. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the grand hall was just as she remembered, empty except for one thing. Music filled the space, a soft, haunting tune that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the ballroom's own walls. Evelyn walked through the empty rooms, the melody growing louder until it was almost deafening. She followed its trail down a long corridor and into what had once been the dance floor. There, illuminated by slivers of moonlight, she saw them, dancers moving gracefully around the room, their feet barely touching the floor. Evelyn stood frozen, watching as the figures waltzed and twirled, their movements too perfect, too controlled for human beings. The music seemed to grow louder, more insistent, drawing her in. As one of the dancers turned, Evelyn saw that it was her grandmother, her mother's mother, dancing with a man dressed in a tuxedo from another era. The pair moved so fluidly, as if guided by unseen hands, and their eyes were fixed on each other, no longer alive or dead, but existing somewhere between. Evelyn watched until the music finally faded away, leaving only an eerie stillness behind. She turned to leave, her heart racing with a mix of fear and fascination, but before she could move, the dancers reappeared and began moving once more, never stopping. As she backed out into the cold night air, Evelyn could hear their steps echoing off the ballroom's walls, and she knew that they would always be there, dancing alone under the endless moonlight. At 3:21 a.m., when the world is hushed and the very air grows cold, I was standing by my phone, an old rotary model that I used only once a week, on the night shift at the local grocery store. Beatrice, Nebraska, isn't much of a place, just a few streets, mostly empty after dark except for the dim glow of streetlights and the occasional car passing by the closed-down gas station down the road. I heard it then, that faint static hiss you sometimes hear on an old radio left on too long. It wasn't static, it was something more, something from inside. I picked up the phone, my hand trembling slightly as it cradled the receiver. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I whispered. The line hummed with a low, eerie sound that felt like it was crawling into my bones. I pressed on, feeling oddly compelled to hear whatever was at the other end. Are you real?" My voice barely made it past the wall of silence. A small wrongness began to seep in as the dial tone turned into a whispering presence. It wasn't anything definite, just the faintest murmur, like someone speaking through a thick fog or perhaps from another dimension. The hairs on my arms stood up. I was suddenly acutely aware of every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. A moment later, the whispers coalesced into words. Do you need something?" The voice was soft, almost childlike in its timidity. It felt as though it had been bottled away for decades before finally breaking free. I hesitated but didn't want to miss this strange opportunity. I thought of the root cellar beneath my old farmhouse. Yes, I said, my mind racing to find a specific question. Is there anything in the cellar? Anything you can show me? The line went quiet again, and for a moment, I wondered if it was just static or that the other end had hung up. But then, a low, resonant voice spoke back, "There are things here. Things that shouldn't be seen." The words echoed in my head as the phone in my hand seemed to grow heavier. Cold air rushed through the line, chilling me from the inside out. The whisper continued, "Look at your feet." I glanced down and realized I had unknowingly stepped into a dark patch on the floor. Shadows danced as if they were alive. Slowly, I moved towards the old door leading to the root cellar. It creaked open reluctantly, revealing darkness that seemed to stretch out into infinity. A shiver ran through me as I felt something watching. Is this what you want?" I asked, my voice barely a croak now. The response came, muffled and distant, yet somehow closer than before, "Show me." My heart pounded in my ears. I hesitated but stepped forward, lowering myself into the cellar. The darkness was palpable, it seemed to press against me from all sides. A faint light flickered on as if by some unseen hand, revealing rows of old wooden crates, cans and jars that held mysteries untold. I approached a single crate at random. As I touched its lid, it began to rise slowly, lifting to reveal not food but instead a small, ornate box with intricate carvings. The voice whispered again, "Open it." My fingers trembled as I unscrewed the lid. Inside was an old photograph, a child with a stern face, standing next to what looked like an ancient wooden rocking chair. But something was wrong. The child's eyes were dark and empty, yet they followed me wherever I moved. The room seemed to grow colder, my breath visible in the air as if it were winter. The voice spoke once more, but this time with a deeper urgency, "Look into his eyes." I hesitated, feeling a growing sense of dread. But curiosity overpowered fear for an instant, and I stared into the child's gaze. Suddenly, the room felt like a prison, the walls closing in on me tighter than before. And then, the voice spoke with a chilling finality, "Do not return." The light flickered out as suddenly as it had come, leaving only darkness. The air grew thick and heavy, and I felt something watching, just beyond the edges of my vision. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't leave, my feet seemed rooted to the spot. The phone clattered to the ground beside me, its ringing piercing the silence. I knew then that whatever was down there in the root cellar would still be waiting for me when I returned. It was the old house on the edge of town. I'd never heard anyone speak about it in such hushed tones until that night when my phone rang at 3 a.m., cutting through the silence with a sharp static. The voice was raspy, like it had been dragged from the depths of a forgotten basement. "Hello? Who is this?" A cold breath tickled the back of my neck. "Salem Midnight Frequencies. You know what to do." Salem. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. I leaned closer to the receiver, squinting at the dial in the dark studio as the voice continued. It was a man, or maybe woman, I couldn't be sure. "Mr. Sullivan, isn't it? Remember me?" I didn't answer right away. Who on earth would call this number in such a deadpan manner? It had been weeks since anyone had used the hotline after a particularly eerie show about spectral horses roaming the hills outside of town. "Look," I began tentatively, "who are you and how do you know my name?" The static hissed again, followed by a long pause. The air felt like it was thickening with cold. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the caller spoke in an eerie whisper that barely carried over the line. "I used to work there. My heart skipped a beat. Work where? The house, she replied, and I could hear the door creaking somewhere in the background. The old one on the edge of town. Before my mind could fully process what she was saying, her voice dropped lower, almost to the point of being indiscernible. Remember, the room they bricked up. A shiver ran down my spine. My imagination started painting scenarios, the whispers, the drafts that never seemed to stop, and a sense of something always lurking just beyond my line of sight. I had heard such stories in the show, glimpses of the unseen lingering in spaces where people forgot to close the door. And what exactly did you see there? I asked, trying not to let my voice waver. Silence again, and that same creaking echoed back. Then she spoke again, her words soft but cutting through the quiet like a knife. A draft, she whispered. A cold draft that won't stop. My fingers clenched around the receiver. A draft? What does that mean? It's always there, even on summer nights, she replied almost imperceptibly. And sometimes, just sometimes, you can hear it too. A tiny voice in my head wondered if I was losing my mind. But then her words came, sharp and clear. Can you hear the whisper now? The question hung heavily in the air. For a moment, nothing else existed but the static of the radio, the draft of cold air that seemed to emanate from the receiver itself, and the lingering doubt that whispered back into my mind. And then I heard it, so faint, so barely there, yet unmistakably real. A whisper, echoing through time and distance as if calling out just for me. Help. The line went dead. Don't touch that dial. Stay with me, the next one is worse. In the quiet, shadowed streets of Grosse Pointe Shores, Michigan, there existed a tale that had lingered through decades, much like the faded paint of its old houses. It was a story whispered among teenagers and shared over beers in basements during late-night sessions, about a house that stood alone on an otherwise cleared street. Its address seemed to echo off the cold, empty lanes, 4137, Northland Drive. The house itself was more than just another abandoned relic of Detroit's past. It had once been a prosperous abode, but over time, it had turned into something more sinister, a silent sentinel in the night. No one could remember who lived there last, or when exactly the last resident left. The years passed and so did the seasons, leaving behind only a few pieces of its former glory, remnants of its past splendor scattered like autumn leaves. One crisp October evening, my friend Tom, with his camera slung loosely across his chest, ventured out for one final ghost hunting expedition before his college classes kicked into full swing. He had heard about 4137 from other enthusiasts in the local paranormal community and decided to check it out alone, despite warnings from his family. Tom parked his car at the end of the empty street, where a single streetlight cast an eerie, flickering light over the asphalt. The air was thick with the crisp scent of autumn, and the silence was almost palpable. He could hear the distant hum of a car on the highway that barely masked the unsettling sounds of the night. Tom approached the house cautiously, his foot tapping nervously against the pavement as he walked up to the porch. It was an old bungalow with peeling paint and overgrown vines creeping up its facade like nature's own graffiti. He noticed the light in the front window was still on, a small lamp casting a warm glow into the darkness. With his camera ready, Tom stepped onto the stoop and knocked softly at the door. No answer. Inside, he could hear an old radio playing softly, music from a bygone era of vinyl records and AM stations. It was then that he realized something was slightly wrong. The house was supposed to be empty. There should have been no sound, save for the distant hum of the highway or the occasional rustle of leaves. But now, the radio's static began to interfere with itself, creating a low, dissonant hum. It was as if the music was trying to escape from inside the house into the night. Tom hesitated and then stepped closer to investigate, his camera ready. As he approached the door again, a gust of wind suddenly pushed at him, causing his hair to lift slightly. He turned to look back at the road, but it was as if a shadowy figure had momentarily obscured his view. Inside, the light grew brighter, casting a harsh white glow that seemed almost unnatural in its intensity. Tom's stomach churned as he realized something was amiss. There were no walls there. Instead, he could see through to an empty room beyond. And at the center of it stood a figure in an old-fashioned dress, her back turned towards him. Tom's breath caught as he watched her. She didn't notice his presence or react to the intrusion. The radio continued its dissonant hum, growing louder until it sounded like whispers. Then, abruptly, silence. The house was quiet again, but Tom couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. He backed out of the doorway slowly, his heart pounding. As he turned to leave, he noticed the light in the front window flickering off and on erratically before finally going out altogether. Standing alone in the darkness, Tom felt a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. He knew then that the house had remained awake long after everyone else went to sleep, and that it was still waiting for someone who might never come back. The phone call came just after 2 a.m., when the night was thick with sleep and the world outside lay quiet under a blanket of stars. I heard a whisper on my speaker, like the wind blowing through an open window. It went, "Bryce." "This is," the voice trailed off, leaving me to wonder who had called in this hour, their name lost in static. Bryce was one of those men you'd never forget once you met him. He'd worked at the old Blue Moon Inn for as long as anyone could remember, 40 years and counting. When he hung up, the only sound left was the soft hum of the radio and a sharp chill that seemed to seep into my bones. "Hello," I said softly into the mic, my voice barely louder than a whisper. Bryce hesitated for what felt like an eternity before finally saying, "This is about the old room. The one nobody ever uses." The Blue Moon Inn was an old place, with faded wallpaper and heavy wooden doors that groaned when you opened them. It sat on the edge of Bardstown, Kentucky, its history as thick as the dust that settled in every corner. Bryce went silent for a moment, then began his story. "You see, there's this last room down the hall. Room 307. No one ever stays there. But I used to check it once a week." I listened intently, setting a cup of coffee on my desk and watching the steam rise, feeling the weight of the night settle on me. "It was just an old room," he continued, his voice wavering slightly as if he was afraid to speak further. "Nothing special about it. But something strange happened." Bryce paused again, and I could almost see him pacing back and forth in that small space behind his office door. The silence stretched, heavy with the knowledge that he had a tale to tell. "One night, when my shift was over, I was walking by room 307, just a quick check like always. But tonight, it felt different." He paused, as if gathering the strength to continue. "I tried the door handle, this old brass knob you couldn't miss, and it turned smoothly. The door swung open with barely a creak." Bryce's words were slow and deliberate, his voice trembling ever so slightly now. I could almost smell the faint musty scent of the room he was describing. Inside, nothing. Just as expected. But there was one more thing. One small detail that made me wonder. He took a deep breath before speaking again, the tension palpable in his voice. "When I entered, everything seemed fine. The bed was tidy, and there were no signs of anyone having been here recently. But there was a faint light at the bottom of one of the drawers." I leaned forward, my interest piqued as much by this small detail as by what might follow. That light caught my eye. I didn't think much of it, maybe just a reflection from somewhere else in the room, but then the line went dead for a moment, and when it came back, his voice had changed. It was quieter, more somber. Then, there was someone inside. My heart raced as I waited for him to continue. Who was inside? What happened? I whispered into the mic. But he didn't answer. The line was silent, save for the faint hiss of static that seemed to mock my silence. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized there might never be an answer. And just like that, Bryce hung up. And that's where we'll close the lines for tonight. If you made it this far, if you're still here in the dark with me, then you're one of us now. The ones who listen after midnight. The ones who don't quite turn the radio all the way off. Before you go, do one thing. Subscribe, and turn on the bell. Every week we bring another lost night back from the static, and you don't want to miss the frequency when it opens again. Until then, keep a light on. Check the locks. And if your phone rings after 3, and there's only static on the other end, you don't have to answer. This has been the Midnight Frequency. Good night. And sleep with the radio on.